As we continue with the Matthew 24 series, I'm going to talk about beginning of sorrows in Matthew 24 that have been analyzed and examined and explained, and it will be the conclusion of this topic. So please join me.
The New Radio Church of God and the Plain and Simple Truth Ministries present the Messenger of the Lord with Apostle Yeshua, preaching the gospel of the good news of the kingdom of God and informing you about world events in the light of Bible prophecy and preparing the way for the return of Jesus Christ. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Apostle Yeshua.
And there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. Matthew 24:7. From my article and podcast, A New Revelation of the Sequence of Events since 2020 and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, God has shown me that the events that are mentioned in Matthew, the 24th chapter, have already begun, but as it is always in typical satanic fashion, somehow the global satanic elite had decided to begin and start them in reverse order. The beginning of sorrows events mentioned by Jesus in Matthew 24:7 are also a very close parallel of the four horsemen of the Apocalypse described in Revelation 6 verses 2 to 8. 2020, the beginning of the end. The pale horsemen of pestilence, viruses, plagues, and diseases began then. The pale horsemen of pestilences, viruses, plagues, and diseases began to gallop at full-blown scale and speed on March of 2020 as the coronavirus began to infect the whole world. Then the Delta strain of the virus showed up very soon afterwards, and most recently the Omicron strain, and a new strain of the virus has shown up in China as well in 2022 to 2023, and also in the US most recently. This is due to the fact that those who have been vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccines, which have an mRNA messenger in them that is programmed to replicate the coronavirus, which they never had before they were vaccinated inside their body, over and over again in their immune system. So this will cause the death toll to increase more and more in the upcoming days. According to the satanic and the powerful global elite, Jesuits like Bill Gates, who has warned that an upcoming pandemic possibly in March of 2024 could be 10 times worse and that humanity is not prepared for it. He also insisted that people must learn the lesson that COVID-19 has given us, according to a quote from the RT portal to an interview with a tycoon for a German media. According to the billionaire, we are not prepared for the next pandemic, quote unquote. In the same way, he hopes that this situation will change in a couple of years or so, and indicated the access of opportunity such as drugs, tests, vaccines, epidemiology, and follow-up. And again, he has quoted as saying, and I quote, "This current COVID-19 situation is bad enough, but a future pandemic could be 10 times even more serious," said the powerful billionaire magnate, who has urged governments to protect their citizens against possible new diseases. Besides this, you need to know that God will be sending out the terrible pale horsemen of the apocalypse very shortly again at his second rerun in a very unusual and weird reverse sequence of events, unlike the ones we've found and already seen in the books of Matthew and Revelation. And when he, Christ, had opened the fourth seal in the 4th month of the Roman year, April, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell, that is the grave, followed with him. Revelation 6 verses 7 through 8. 2021 was a time of great troubles and famine began. The black horse of famine and drought and food shortages began in 2021. One night I had a very disturbing dream. I dreamed that I was in some sort of work environment, and there was one of those coffee machines in front of me, and I pressed the red button and the cup fell down and was filled with water, but it was just that, hot water. So I grabbed that cup before other anxious hands and arms would get to it, and I also remember going by the streets and started looking for someone I knew or recognized, and I saw a woman whom I knew and told her, "Can you please take this cup and fill it with coffee and sugar for me?" And she kindly agreed, and then I woke up. Now can you imagine the upcoming food shortages, hunger, starvation, and famine, that it would even be very hard to get a cup of coffee? Well, you better be prepared, for that is coming soon. And when he opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, "Come and see." And I beheld and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts in heaven say, "A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." Revelation 6:5-6. Despite control efforts, desert locusts are spreading to new areas of Ethiopia in vast numbers. According to most of the government data provided on 7 January of 2020, and even recently, desert locusts has had infested more than 2,350 kilometers of land across the Afar, Amhara, Oromia, Somali, Tigray, and Southern nations, nationalities and peoples, SNMP regional states, as well as in dire adversity. The insects have spread to around 125 woredas or districts, up from 56 in October of 2019. The invasion could lead to a considerable drop in agricultural production, livestock feed, and forest cover, compromising livelihoods and food security in Ethiopia and neighboring countries, warned Fatuma Said, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, who is a well-known UN representative in Ethiopia. Another headline reads, 45 million people are threatened by famine in southern Africa due to drought, floods, and economic hardship in their countries, the United Nations warned on Thursday. This hunger crisis is reaching unprecedented proportions, and our field observations show that it will still get worse, says Lola Castro from the World Food Program. Famine is already present in our countries, but millions more people are at risk. The World Food Program, the WFP, warned just recently, underscoring the need for urgent funding and humanitarian access to reach those in need. Recent analysis by the UN agency reveals 41 million people in 43 countries are teetering on the very edge of famine, up from 27 million 2 years ago. They need help now. I am heartbroken at what we are facing now in 2024. We now have 4 countries where famine-like conditions are present. WFP Chief David Beasley told his executive board on Monday, according to a press release. He described the situation as just tragic, as these are real people with real names. WFP said 584,000 people are already experiencing famine-like conditions in Ethiopia, Madagascar, South Sudan, and Yemen. Nigeria and Burkina Faso are also of particular concern, as they have pockets where famine-like conditions are present. In Somalia in 2011, 260,000 people died of hunger, and by the time the famine was actually declared, half of that number had already died. Mr. Beasley had also recalled, "We can't debate the numbers to death when people really need our help," quote unquote. Conflict, climate change, and currency depreciation. Hunger has risen due to conflict, climate change, and economic shocks, WFP said. However, soaring prices for basic foods have also compounded the critical situation, with the global cost of maize rising almost 90% year on year, for example. In many countries, currency depreciation is also a factor, the agency added. This has driven prices even higher, stoking food insecurity in places such as Lebanon, Nigeria, Sudan, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. The WFP is hastily and desperately trying increasingly this year mounting its biggest operation ever, targeting 139 million people due to the various conflicts around the world like the Ukrainian-Russia war and the Hamas-Israeli war. With the sufficient funding and access, the agency said it can provide them with plenty life-saving food and nutritional assistance. Mr. Beasley underlined the urgent need for support, and I quote, "I want to emphasize just how bad it is out there. Today, 41 million people are literally knocking on famine's door. The price tag to reach every one of them is about $6 billion. We need funding and we need it now," he said. And when he, Christ, had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, "Come and see," and I beheld and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, "A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." Revelation 6:5-6. For 5 years now, the entire southern tip of Africa suffered from a significant lack of rain, aggravated by repeated episodes of the climatic anomaly known as El Niño, which affect agricultural crops in 16 countries, mostly very poor. Global warming temperatures are also causing increasingly violent storms and hurricanes, as we have seen recently. Last year, the tropical cyclone Idai caused catastrophic floods in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, killing more than 1,000 people, creating significant damage, and leaving several million people in despair. This year, World Food Program plans to assist 8.3 million people who are facing food insecurity in very poor countries and harsh places like Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, Madagascar, Namibia, Lesotho, Eswatini, and Malawi. The UN agency reiterated recently its urgent appeal to the international community and donors, saying it has only received $205 million so far out of the $489 million needed to fund its emergency aid projects. And there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. Matthew 24:6. We have also seen the swarm of locusts all over Africa, creating an incredible drought and famine in that region, and we are continually going through the coronavirus and COVID-19 pandemic amidst an never-ending series of diverse earthquakes all over the world right now. United Nations AP, the head of the World Food Program, says the Nobel Peace Prize has given the UN agency a spotlight and megaphone to warn world leaders that this year is going to be worse than last year. And without billions of dollars, we're going to have famines of biblical proportions in 2024. David Beasley said in another recent interesting interview with the Associated Press that the Norwegian Nobel Committee was looking at the work the agency does every day in conflicts, disasters, and refugee camps, often putting staffers' lives at risk to feed millions of hungry people, but also to send a message to the world that it's getting worse out there and that our hardest work is yet to come. God has also revealed to me that there will be massive food shortages in supermarkets worldwide coming up in the next year of 2024. All crops will be ruined by massive swarms of locusts all over the world, and also that water shortages will become evident soon. It will be horrible and disastrous in the next 2 months. Worldwide surge in great earthquakes seen in the past 10 years. The global rate of great earthquakes nearly tripled in recent years, but does that portend a problem for an unruptured faults along the northwest U.S.? The annual number of great earthquakes nearly tripled over the last decade, as providing a reminder to Americans that unruptured faults like those well-known ones in the American Northwest of the United States might be due for a big one. Between 2004 and 2014, 18 earthquakes with magnitudes of 8.0 or more rattled subduction zones around the globe. That's an increase of 265% over the average rate of the previous century, which saw 71 great quakes, according to a report to the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America this week in Vancouver, British Columbia. It's clear that recent great earthquakes triggered related major quakes, says study author Thurney Lay, distinguished professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at the University of California, Santa Cruz. If we look at all earthquake magnitudes within the past 10 years, it's not unusual in terms of the rate of events, and the rate increases are just seen for events with magnitudes larger than 7.5 or so, he said. This suggests that great events were catching up on the plate boundary motions in several regions with a fortuitous similar timing. And by fortuitous, Lane means that he thinks it's just coincidence that all those big earthquakes happened over the last 10 years. It's not coincidence, sir. It's because Christ predicted this will happen. Related quakes strike along same faults. So Lane isn't really suggesting that an earthquake in Japan or Sumatra is going to trigger a big one in the Cascadia subduction zone. The line along the coast of Washington, Oregon, and northernmost California, where the oceanic plates dive under the continental plate. But he says a big earthquake at one end of a subduction zone might trigger others farther down along the same fault. This happened in Sumatra, where the great 2004 event activated the adjacent 2005 event, and those two activated a slightly more distant 2007 event, he said. So what does that mean for the Cascadia subduction zone? The offshore fault appears to be fully locked up by friction, with strain building up until the next large earthquake rupture releases it, Lay says. But nobody can predict exactly when that might happen or what it will be like. Well, that's according to this idiot. Obviously, he doesn't know that God has already prophesied this in the Bible. The last 10 years have been interesting for seismologists because we have truly learned that great subduction zone earthquakes occur in many different ways, and there do not seem to be any simple rules out there to predict the kind of behavior to expect, says Peter Shearer, a professor of geophysics at the Institute of Geophysics and Planetary Physics at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego. And I quote, "Thus, we can reliably assess at this point where the Cascadia subduction zone will eventually break, mostly in a single giant earthquake or a series of large earthquakes." Well, I'm telling you in God's own authority that the big one, at the San Andreas Fault, will come in this year of 2024 with a 9.9 in the Richter scale. And I'm a prophet of God, so I know what I'm talking about. He said more study of past Cascadia quakes and those elsewhere, along with analysis of the recent crop of great quakes, might lead to better predictions. Climate in crisis, as scientists grieving over climate change in action searches for peace and an eco-friendly homestead. Every 500 years or so. One of the researchers scoping out Cascadia's history of ancient earthquakes is Benjamin Horton, a professor in the Department of Marine and Coastal Science at Rogers University. Horton has trenched and has scored in the mud along the coast of British Columbia and the northwest United States looking for evidence of earthquakes big enough to trigger massive tsunamis. And he's found evidence of 12 major earthquakes over a 6,000 year period, an average recurrence interval of 500 years. But that's just an average, he says, adding that the time between big quakes could be anywhere from 350 to 1,000 years. Cascadia is a really interesting story because there are no written records of a large earthquake there, Horton says. The last time it ruptured was January 26, 1700 AD, over 300 years ago. The European colonizers hadn't reached the west coast yet. We know about it because of the tsunami that resulted from it, which did hit Japan, where historical records of samurai talk about an orphan tsunami, which means a tsunami without a parent earthquake. It's not like you can say they occur every 500 years, so the next one won't be till 2200, and we don't need to worry. Those records helped scientists figure out that the 1700 earthquake was a whopper. It was somewhere between 8.9 and 9.2 and may have ruptured along a 600-mile span of the western US and Canada, Horton says. It's very analogous to the Sumatra event of 2004, and that fits right in with magnitude seen in subduction zone earthquakes. The size of earthquakes is related to the surface area of the fault that slips, Shearer said. The San Andreas Fault and others transform or stripe slip faults are very wide as they cut vertically, through the Earth's brittle upper crust. In contrast, subduction zone faults are both long and wide as they cut a very shallow angle through the crust. Thus, the surface area for the fault slip can be much larger for subduction zone earthquakes than for transform faults, and the corresponding magnitudes for subduction zone earthquakes can be much greater. The largest transform fault earthquakes are about magnitude 8.5, whereas subduction zone earthquakes can be as large as magnitude 9.5. Horton and his team looked for signs of a big tsunami in the layers of the shoreline mud and at the bottom of the deep sea. Within the mud, we find a lot of sand layers that have been deposited by the tsunamis. And in the submarine canyons, you also find evidence ground shaking causes movement of sediments from the continental shelf out to the deep sea bottom. Because of the wide-ranging recurrence intervals, it is impossible to determine how worried we should be. Horton says, it's not like you can say that they occur every 500 years, so the next one won't be till 2200, and we don't need to worry, he adds. The average interval is every 500 years, but it can be much smaller. Now, all of this information is based on scientific and geological data in regards to the subject of earthquakes as evidence recorded and studied by famous geologists and seismologists. But obviously, these men don't know what God's Word, the Bible, says about earthquakes in diverse places, as written in Matthew 24:7, which was a warning from Jesus Christ himself for our time today. So I will continue with the study of this important chapter of Matthew 24 series in the next podcast, and you will get to see how everything connects with the prophetic words of Christ. Until next time, this is Apostle Yeshurun saying goodbye, friends.
You have heard the messenger of the Lord with Apostle Yeshurun, preparing the way for the return of Jesus Christ. For more information on this podcast and this program, you may write us by email at Yeshurun, Apostle of the Lord, at AOL.com. Again, that is Yeshurun, Yeshurun, Apostle of the Lord, at AOL.com. This podcast was sponsored by the New Radio Church of God and the Plain and Simple Truth Ministries, and by the free will offerings, tithes, and donations of those who are listeners of this podcast and are supporters of this great work of God. The preceding program has been a Plain and Simple Truth Ministries presentation.